everybody, it's your friendly digital technology librarian, Christy here. We've reached another Friday, so of course I have another Film Rec Friday ready for everybody out there. Now, November 1st marks the beginning of Native American Heritage Month, and we are celebrating with a trio of truly phenomenal documentaries. These 3 films are designed to make us think, to make us feel, and to make us question some topics that might make us a little bit uncomfortable. It might make us question things that we definitely had opinions about before, or it might make us question things that we didn't really think were even an issue. As always, these films are available entirely for free with the use of your Milan-Berlin library card. And without any further ado, let's jump into the Rex. Okay, so starting things off with a recommendation from Hoopla, this is 2014's documentary Up Heartbreak Hill. This is a really, really fascinating chronicle of a couple of teens' final year in high school as they sort of approach the whole concept of leaving the nest. This is an issue that comes up regardless of what culture you're from, regardless of where you are located. There's always that really challenging year where you're kind of figuring out how to be an adult. And in Up Heartbreak Hill, when we follow Thomas and Tamara, they are these 2 Native American teenagers who are both gifted in athletics. Tamara is class president. She does really well academically. And these 2 are both part of reservation life, but they are sort of on the cusp of potentially no longer being part of that tight-knit community. And what this documentary does so well is it really immerses you into that particular moment in these kids' lives. So, like I said, most teenagers go through this moment, right? A lot of us have that question of, should we stay close to home or should we travel, get out there, explore the world? And for these 2 in particular, that question becomes a lot more challenging because they are feeling your standard, how to be an adult feelings that most older teens get, but also they have that sort of cultural connection to the others on the reservation. There's that responsibility that they feel to do things a certain way. Is deciding to go to a school far away a statement about where they came from? Is that saying that reservation life is bad? Is it abandoning the people who raised them? And that's a lot to have to deal with when you're an 18-year-old kid. And on top of those sort of incredibly complicated questions about familial and societal responsibility, you're also dealing with just general teenager stuff. So they're finishing school. They're both really, really active athletes. Thomas has a huge potential as far as being a runner goes, and they're trying to balance all of those things. And high school was a long time ago for me, but I remember I was a basket case the last year of school, like trying to figure out, how to navigate everything. And then you throw all of these other elements on top of that, on top of what every teenager feels. And it just becomes this really engrossing coming of age story. It doesn't necessarily feel like you're watching some stale picture about a couple of kids. It really, really doesn't. It grabs you just like your standard biopic would. You feel the pressure with them. You want them to make decisions that will benefit them the most, but at the same time, it's really, really easy to understand why some of these questions are not so easily answered, why everything is really very, very murky. The documentary does a really good job of balancing things from the viewpoint of a traditional audience member who doesn't have any clue about reservation life, but it also, gives a lot of weight to those pressures that you would be feeling. It's not like an easy outsider kind of film where you're just like, well, of course they should go where they can get the best education. They can, experience all of these things, which for me is generally the way that I tend to think. You should always go where you will benefit yourself the most as far as growth goes. But it's not that kind of a simple response anymore when you're watching it. You really, really do feel the weight that they're feeling. And it's really hard to watch that aspect of things play out on screen. You want the best for these kids, but what is the best? And that's another element that we were talking about. Like, our viewpoint is something that we're quite used to, right? But these films, all three of them, but in particular this one, sort of forces you to look at things from in a different way than maybe you normally do. This particular documentary has a ton of interviews with the kids themselves. Of course, we are chronicling their lives, but it also interviews, their parental figures, their teachers, their peers. You get a really well-rounded viewpoint of who these kids are, and Thomas and Tamara, they have a huge amount of potential, and you really do hope that they are able to find the road that makes them happiest by the end of the documentary. I think that's the key. Like, it's no longer about what you went in feeling, what you went in thinking, of course this is an easy decision to make. It's not. It really is what is going to make them the happiest by the end. You really do feel that way. So if you are looking for a really, really engrossing coming of age story, if you are curious about what teens might be feeling within a different culture from your own, how their viewpoint might differ from yours, but also how it might be very, very much similar to yours, check out Up Heartbreak Hill. It's really, really well done, and I can't recommend it enough. It's an excellent, excellent documentary. Must watch. Okay, our next recommendation is available on Canopy, and that is 2010's A Good Day to Die. This is one of those documentaries that sticks with you, man. I did not know a huge amount about the subject of this particular documentary, but I've already checked out a couple of books just because I just feel really uneducated about this particular time period and this particular situation beyond like the little snippets I've heard in the news. A Good Day to Die follows the development of the AIM movement, which is the American Indian movement, and in particular focuses on the life of Dennis Banks, who is one of the co-founders of this particular movement in the 60s. He is a pretty controversial figure. He's somebody that I had absolutely heard about prior to watching this film, but really the only information I knew about him was what I had seen on old clips, and this is terrible, but primarily in association with like documentaries about Marlon Brando, because there was a connection there. And I just, in all honesty, never really delved into this particular figure's life, and it is a fascinating one. Again, he's a controversial figure, but I think this documentary does an excellent job of showing a pretty full picture of who this man is. It does a huge amount of interviews directly with him, but also with a lot of people who were involved in the AIM movement. It doesn't shy away from the controversy surrounding the AIM movement and all of the things that occurred during that period of time, whether we are talking about the sort of riots that occurred in strategic places, the way that he kind of planned things out to make Native people's issues more visible to the general public, which of course, especially in the 60s, they really weren't. There were tons of issues going on, but it wasn't necessarily something that was being covered by the news constantly. So he did what he felt was the best way to have more of his people's voices be heard, for better or worse. It also does touch on a couple of criminal cases that were definitely peripheral to the AIM movement, and those are really, really fascinatingly covered in this particular documentary. And it does all of this with what I would say is a pretty even tone. I do think that this is less of a pointed, objective documentary, in that, like, it does have an opinion. It absolutely does, but it's not force feeding you that particular opinion. It really does do a pretty good job of staying even toned and presenting the facts, presenting these people as they feel they should be presented. It's not like weirdly cut to make Banks look like a good guy or a bad guy. He just looks like Dennis Banks. This is who he is. This is his life story. And he has had a really complicated life, like from early childhood onward. His experiences, and he talks about how when he was in the military, he was stationed in Japan, and some of the things that happened to him in Japan definitely colored the way he looked at certain situations back home. He was dishonorably discharged from the military. It does dive a little bit into that circumstance and why he felt that he could not be a part of that particular organization. And it's really pretty even toned throughout all of this. It was really pretty fascinating. It's not dry, but it manages not to sort of smack you over the head with the way it wants you to look at the picture. It really does want you to think. It really makes you want to draw your own conclusions. Who is this man? Why did he do the things that he did? And why was he driven to do these particular things, which I think are maybe some of the most important questions. Why do we get to the point where we have the kind of protests that we do, where maybe the protest isn't, a simple sit-in where no violence happens? What spurs that violence? Things, and it's, again, very, very complicated. These are all issues that you're not going to necessarily have an epiphany over with one watch, but ideally these particular films will cause you to want to go out, cause you to want to check out books about these people, about these situations, and about the history that is behind it. So this particular documentary is from 2010, like I mentioned. So there's been a pretty good stretch of time, and there's a lot more that you can pick up as far as extra information that's been written and produced within that last 12 years. That's terrifying, 12 years. But I do still highly recommend this particular documentary. I've seen a lot of reviewers and critics use the word bittersweet to describe it, and I think that is incredibly accurate. There are some really, really hard moments to watch. I mean, really hard moments to watch. There are some really difficult interviews to follow, just because there are a lot of really raw emotions that go on in it, and it's I think always a challenge to then divorce yourself from the person you're immediately seeing sort of unfold in front of you on screen. But I think it's unbelievably compelling, and I think it's a really important film to watch, if only to spur you to do further research about these particular topics. So again, if you're looking for an incredibly good documentary about a figure in history that I think we don't necessarily look to all that often, about a particular movement that maybe doesn't get as much attention as it probably should, then make sure you check out A Good Day to Die on Canopy. It is an excellent film, very well made, but then just with a topic that's really, really fascinating. Okay, my final recommendation for today is also available on Canopy, and that is 2017's More Than a Word. I think of all three of these documentaries, this is probably the one that would hit closest to home for the majority of us because this one really focuses on the depiction of Native Americans within sports mascotting. It's interesting how this is one of those topics that is always debated. People have been debating this sort of thing from pretty much the beginning of sports mascotting, um, and it's interesting to have grown up in one of the cities where we have seen the shift happen. I'm a lifelong Cleveland baseball fan. I still remember going and sitting in the bleachers at the very old stadium whose name I don't even recall, back in the day, whatever was before Jacobs Field. I can't even remember at this point. It's been that long. But I still remember. And at that point, we were still Cleveland Indians. We had Chief Oahu as the mascot. It was a thing. And of course, at the time, I was just a kid. I never really asked questions about it. It didn't seem odd or unusual to me. And it's only as we grow older that we realize this representation might have other connotations to it. It's not just about your baseball team, it's about a lot of other elements. And regardless of where you fall on the line of whether you don't think that native depictions of sport mascotting is a bad thing, or if you do think it is, I do think that this documentary is absolutely fascinating to watch. It definitely has an opinion. There's no way for me to get around that. Like, it's very clear that they have an opinion, but they do interview people who feel both ways about the particular situation. I also think that the people they interview who are opposed to having these kinds of mascots are so articulate about the situation. If you have never had the chance to really sort of divorce yourself from the idea of the nostalgia of these characters, the nostalgia of these images that we've grown up with, I do think this documentary does an excellent job of having a measured tone with regard to why we might want to question those things, why we might want to look at things from a different vantage point or viewpoint, and at no point do you feel judged. And that's a thing that, I mean, I think because sports is such a sort of history tied thing to most families, like we all, like I said, I remember going to baseball games with my dad and my grandfather when I was super small, like maybe not even in school yet. I think situations like that always make us cling to the concept of a simple nostalgia. And what this documentary does a good job of is not saying that that connection is bad, but really diving into what are these mascots really saying. There's history there too. There's history within a stereotypical image. There's history within, using these terms that maybe we don't have a negative connotation to in contemporary society, but we certainly did in the past. And how adopting these things says something that maybe don't want it to. And like I said, it's probably the most challenging documentary of the three to watch. They definitely interview people on both sides of the line. I will say it's filmed in a way that it's very clear how the filmmakers feel, but you do at least get multiple vantage points as far as this particular issue goes. I do think it does a good job of showing how some arguments are maybe not as well thought out as others, or maybe how some arguments very definitely have only looked at it from a certain point of view, have only seen this issue from one angle. And it does a good job of showing, hey, so I get it, but look at this. And you see that on screen, and it's very clear on screen. But yeah, I do think that this documentary was so interesting to watch. Um, I yeah, I just really think that it's probably my pick of the week, honestly, because I'm someone who's grown up in a city that had such a strong tie to a specifically named team and that has now transitioned to something else. And I don't know, I just feel like this kind of a topic where where it's not necessarily a life or death topic, but something that is certainly very in your face, because you hear about sports teams pretty regularly. Whether you're a sports fan or not, like, you're going to hear about that city's team and how it's so pervasive. I do think that this kind of a documentary that touches on a topic like that is, like, at least for at least for certain seasons, something you hear about every day. I think this was a really important one to watch and maybe look at, and just again try and see things from multiple viewpoints. So, for what it's worth, strong recommendation for More Than a Word. It's my pick of the week, and it's available on Canopy. Okay, so those were my picks for this week. If you have any recommendations for films about Native American issues or topics that can be celebrated this month, please comment with those below. If you have any recommendations for themes you'd like to see us cover in the future, definitely let me know about those. Always looking for new topics that you might be interested in. As always, thank you so much for joining me. I absolutely adore going into our catalog, looking up the different films for these different issues, and hopefully you had a good time and you were able to find a couple of films that you might be interested in checking out. And without any further ado, I'm going to go ahead and close out this episode, and hopefully I will see you next week. Bye-bye!